It seems that the Leagues of Votann are doing rather well, winning 2 tournaments recently and placing high at a bunch of others. Let's talk about 4 strong army lists for the faction and the units that help make them good. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about some lists for the kin once more. After getting some rather massive boosts from the balanced data slate, it seems that the Leagues of Votann are actually challenging to be one of the stronger armies in Warhammer 40k, at least from initial impressions. Before Games Workshop's rather enormous balance pass, they were generally considered perhaps the single worst army in the game for competitive play at least, win rates pretty dismal at around about 32%, and basically no one having any large amount of success at tournaments. In the balanced data slate though, they had 2 rather good changes, where previously you could just mark 1 enemy unit for death with the +1 to hit and wound from the judgment tokens at the start of the game. Now you can do so with 4. I feel like that goes from a slightly niche boost to covering the vast majority of the important stuff in the opponent's army, particularly if you happen to be playing against an army with just a few really big threatening Death Star type units. You could make them very easy to put down. Combined with that as well, Games Workshop gave them some very big points cuts, lots of units dropping at around about the 20% kind of mark, and it means that you can put quite a lot of kin on the table now. I'd still say that perhaps a few units, particularly Hearthguard warriors, feel a little bit borderline for their cost, but most of the rest for the codex feels really quite cheap now, even if maybe it has made a few of the armies in 40k need a few more models if you're playing at any given points value. Things like the Hexton Land Fortress being at just over 200 points does feel a bit weird, say compared with some of the faction's other tanks in 40k, like Imperial Guard Demolisher tanks that are 200. At least of initial impressions of a successful tournament list, a few units maybe do seem to get played a bit more than most. It's not like the Leagues of Votann have a particularly big unit pool, but maybe things like Sagitaurs in particular, the Brokhyr Thunderkyn with graviton weapons and 10 strong units of Einhyr Hearthguard do seem to be particularly popular choices, though it does seem that literally everything in the codex does get played competitively to some extent, maybe with the sole exception of Uthar the Destined still. For enhancements, a fair few people tend to use Grim Demeanor to ignore modifiers for a unit, and Appraising Glare to spread a bit more judgment token love, though I would say that Appraising Glare and maybe even Carls themselves have actually declined in importance just a tiny bit, given that you get so many automatic judgment tokens at the start of the game now. Getting into the army list though, and this one was run by someone called Eirik, who used it to take first at Invasion 40k GT, winning 5 games, losing none, and getting 1 draw against Vanguard Onslaught Tyranids in the last round of the 6th round event. Pretty impressive to see the Leagues of Votann topping a really quite big tournament like this with 85 players. That would have been basically unthinkable prior to the balanced data slate. This one's really quite a nice mixed and pretty balanced looking Leagues of Votann list. Perhaps going particularly heavy on the vehicles of 2 Land Fortresses and 2 Sagitaurs, and 2 big blocks of 10-man Einhyr Hearthguard. The Land Fortresses do really feel quite efficient for their damage and defense now. These ones are taking the heavy SP conversion beamers, which are probably my favourite out of the 3 main guns on offer. Really quite massive firepower if you can keep them within their optimal range, backed up by bolt cannons and scanners for ignore cover. The 2 Sagitaurs take the high las beam cannons for a bit of focused anti-tank. It looks like their job is going to be to split the Hearthguard warriors into 2 chunks. There's a single unit of those with bolters, the high las rifle and the rail rifle, and that means that you can get 2 quite small objective taking squads that have the sticky objectives type rule. Sagitaurs are just really quite common in lists now at only 100 points with their scout move. The big blocks of the Einhyr Hearthguard have concussion gauntlets for the damage too, Vulcanite firepower for some devastating wounds, and teleport crest to get them into battle. They could be a good choice for rapid ingressing in maybe. And they're the ones that get the -1 to the wound roll if they're accompanied by a character, so either the Carls or the Einhyr champion would go with them. Either bringing a bit more judgment or just some raw damage with the Einhyr champion. He takes the Mass Hammer and Weaverfield crest for really quite some nasty anti-tank threat and good defense. There's then a unit of 6 Brokhyr Thunderkyn that looks like they'll be adjoined by the Brokhyr Ironmaster with Appraising Glare. We'll take a look at their datasheet later in a video, but the Graviton Blast Cannons are just very efficient for 25 points each, and the Ironmaster can give them +1 to hit against all targets, even things without judgment on them. The Ironmaster's got the Appraising Glare trait, the one where you get to mark 1 objective for counting as being higher judgment than it would be normally. And one of the Carls has Grim Demeanor for ignoring the modifiers. I guess he'd certainly want to go with one of the Einhyr Hearthguard blocks. Ignoring modifiers when you've got 10 very scary models on the table is pretty cool. Finally, to complete the list, there's 2 units of Hernkin Pioneers, They take the fairly standard loadout of high-las rotary cannon, scanner pack, and searchlight. That does seem to be the standard for those guys for some scouting and alpha strike type goodness, with a bunch of damage 2 shots from their autocannons. Overall, really quite cool stuff, and given that a whole bunch of this is now going to be basically +1 to hit and +1 to wound against the majority of the enemy big threats, it's just remarkably scary damage output. They've got lots of firepower from their tanks. Brokhyr Thunderkyn are a threat to just about anything that they can get in range with, and the Einhyr are pretty balanced both with range and melee, just loads of volume attacks that are going to chip away at anything. Scary stuff unless you can screen or outrange things, or put down the units before they get to damage you too heavily. Cool to see Votann doing well again. Einhyr Hearthguard definitely still seem to be remaining one of the staples of Votann army lists going forward. They dropped 3 points per model in the data slate from 165 down to 150, though it seems that most of the time the play seems to be to run big units of 10 of them at 300 points, and then attach a character to the unit as that gives them the -1 to wound, really quite nice in combination with toughness 6 and a 2+ save, though with only 2 wounds they are a little bit more susceptible to a bunch of more volume fire type attacks, at least when compared with big Terminator bricks that some of the Space Marines can get. In general for combat, I'd be much more tempted to go with the gauntlets for the strength 9 and damage 2 attacks, even if you only get 2 of them. I feel like the damage 2 is worth it compared with getting the 3rd attack with the plasma blades. Though I do quite like both of the ranged guns, I'd probably be a bit more tempted by Vulcanite over the plasma, but high AP and damage 2 is never really going to be too bad. I'd generally be tempted to deep strike them with the teleport crest, maybe rapid ingress if it makes sense. Rapid ingress does work quite nicely for them as they're a unit that really wants to be able to get a round of firepower off and then charge in. Moving on to the second list, and this is one by someone called Xantukal, who used this to place 5th at the From Hell Open 40k Grand Tournament. This one again really quite a big one with 90 players and only had 1 loss. It appears to Chaos Space Marines round 2. Definitely a very different flavour of list as Leagues of Votann go. This one seems to eschew the Einhyr Hearthguard altogether, instead going very heavy on Mech Votann. 3 Hecaton Land Fortresses, again all with the conversion beamers once more, and 3 Sagitaurs, these ones taking the missile launchers, the other good loadout for those guys. I guess that the Land Fortresses would probably be transporting at least some of the Brokhyr Thunderkyn with Graviton Blast Cannons again once more. There's 1 big unit of 6 of them and 2 units of 3. They work quite nicely with the Hecaton Land Fortresses, given that they can get them in range with their slightly shorter range guns, and they can also allow them to fully reroll the wound roll when they target the same thing as them on the turn that they get out, which I think is pretty spectacular with the Grav Cannon profiles. They are really quite general purpose and mid-strength, and getting both +1 to wound and reroll all wounds is going to lead to some spectacular damage. Could be quite nice for the smaller units of 3 maybe, but then there are really quite a lot of other options for putting in transports. 2 units of Chthonian Berserks with mole grenades and 1 squad with axes and 1 with mauls. I guess that they'd probably be riding in the Sagitaurs to scout them forward and then get some early game charges. Chthonian Berserks I did think were kind of weak previously, but they went down really quite a lot in the balanced data slate. They're now only 100 points for a squad of 5 Angry Space Dwarves. Finally there's 2 squads of Hearthkin Warriors. These guys take Ion Blasters this time, and they have both the high-las rifle and the high-las rotary cannon, the new option from the Kill Team kit. I guess at least some of them might well being split in half by the Sagitaurs, and you could certainly put 1 in one of the Land Fortresses for the shooting buffs once more. Leading the list is the Brokhyr Ironmaster again. He takes Grim Demeanor for ignoring modifiers for his unit. It seems pretty likely that he will be leading up the big unit of 6 Brokhyr Thunderkyn. He gives them +1 to wound and heals the exoframes. I really think that that's really quite an efficient unit for just over 200 points. Enormous firepower, pretty good defense with healing, and even the little assistance that the Brokhyr brings along could be used to tank some really big high power shots, things like las cannons that otherwise could have been striking Thunderkyn. Finally there's some Votann Psykers on the go, 2 Grimnir with their fairly powerful psychic shooting and making a squad tougher if they wish to. Their only option for squads to join are the Hearthkin Warriors. You could make a unit a little bit tougher for holding an objective, plus their shooting does add a fair bit of general purpose threat to the unit. It's quite a good profile for killing things like Space Marines, and hits on a 2+ at 24-inch range with 6 shots, generally going to be just about as scary as the entire squad worth of Hearthkin Warriors shooting put together in some circumstances. Beyond that there's just a small unit of 3 Hernkin with the same standard loadout, and overall quite interesting to see a fairly different feeling Votann list. Cool to see some Berserks back on the table, and pretty interesting seeing a list with no Karls or Einhyr Hearthguard, definitely units that would have been considered absolute staples prior to the balance pass. For focal units though, Brokhyr Thunderkyn definitely felt like they were doing some heavy lifting in that list. Again, they feel like perhaps one of the most auto-include units for Leagues of Votann at the moment. 3 to 6 models, either 75 points or 150 points. These went down pretty massively from 95 points for 3 of them at first release of the index. These guys are just all round solid for the cost. The defense is good with those exo frames for 25 points per model. Toughness 6, 3 wounds and a 3+ save is absolutely fine. They'll definitely absorb a whole load of small arms fire, and they're not desperately expensive per point against anti-tank things. And as you've seen by the first couple of lists, people do almost always tend to go for the Graviton blast cannons, which just have a massively threatening profile. They're only 18-inch range, but they're D6 shots at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2, and with anti-vehicle 2+ and blast. All of that put together just means that they rarely have any particularly bad targets that they don't want to be firing against. The profile is just excellent for killing Space Marines. Hordes will be extra punished by the blast keyword, getting a whole load of extra shots against the targets. Even bigger monsters and things will still have to fear them somewhat, with a +1 to wound being handed out by judgment tokens quite a bit. And of course, vehicles are not going to want to get in their way if they're getting wounded on a 2+, with a whole bunch of attacks with decent AP and damage. They're close to threat range, and hopefully trying to get the strike on the enemy before the enemy gets to hit them is probably the biggest challenge. They could maybe do that either with strategic reserves or a land fortress as potential options though. And as mentioned earlier, I feel like the Brokhyr Ironmaster is a pretty reasonable upgrade for a bigger squad of them. He chips in with his own grav attacks, makes them +1 to hit, repairs damage, and tanks more damage on his ECOG assistance. There's a lot to like there. For our third list, here's one by a Nicholas Olsen Johnson, who used it to take third at Harbour Heresy, going 4-1 against 30 players, and it looks like on Best Coast pairings he was very close to winning the event with it. It appears that he just got a single loss to Wardog Spam Chaos Knights on round 5 just by a single point, so this was very nearly another Leagues of Votann tournament win as well. Again, this one's another interesting variation on the Leagues of Votann's limited unit pool. The difference between the first two is that this one doesn't have any land fortresses, instead there's just 4 Sagitaurs here, all with the missile launchers. You can take 4 as their dedicated transports. Looks like they'll be scouting up with the unit of Hearthguard warriors split between 2 of them, and the 2 units of Chthonian Berserks riding in another 2. Quite nice multiple small units to rush at the enemy and take those midfield objectives, and the Sagitaurs put out lots of firepower and are just all round efficient for their cost. Interesting that the Hearthguard warriors actually seem to be spec for melee in this one as well, which is kind of fun. They've got iron blasters and 3 kin melee weapons in the unit, so perhaps just a little bit more punchy than you might otherwise expect them to be. Otherwise, again, like the first list, there's a couple of big blocks of Einhyr Hearthguard here, again taking the damage 2 concussion gauntlets, but these ones are using the plasma guns instead for a bunch of strength 8 and damage 2 goodness. Looks like these guys are going to be headed up by a pair of Einhyr champions. One takes the Darkstar axe and the Weaverfield crest, and he has the Wayfarer's Grace as well. That's the one where if the champion is killed, he gets to stand up on a 2+. Might be better on the unit that you're playing slightly more aggressive with, I suppose. The other one takes the Mighty Mass Hammer and a Praising Glare for the judgment tokens around one objective. Otherwise, there's a Carl who I'd guess will be running with one of the squads of Hearthguard warriors, perhaps, unless one of the Einhyr champions is being adventurous and running off on their own. I suppose you could do that a bit more reliably with the Wayfarer's Grace one if you wanted. Again, there's 2 units of the Brokhyr Thunderkyn with the grav cannons, one of 6 and one of 3. And then 2 units of Hernkin Pioneers with the High-Las Scanner and Searchlight combo. Looks like the Einhyr champions are definitely still being used to some competitive success, which is fun. Appearing in just about every competitive Votann list at the moment is the Sagitaur, provided you can find any that are actually in stock from Games Workshop, of course. That has been a bit of an issue. The Sagitaurs are 100 points a pop with a transport capacity of 6. Generally they're going to be holding either Chthonian Berserks or Hearthguard warriors unless you're doing fun things with independent characters running around, and they are kind of interesting in that you can use them to split one of the 10-man Hearthguard squads in 2, giving you the option of 5-man troops choices, something that's kind of nice given the Leagues of Votann don't really have too many squads that are very cheap and expendable running independently. Beyond that though, they just seem very efficient all round, pretty fast moving gun turrets with a 12-inch move, reasonably tough at toughness 10, though only 9 wounds. Overall maybe kind of comparable durability to something like a Space Marine Rhino, but hitting far harder with its weapons. The Sagitaur gets a twin-linked bolt cannon, and then for the better shooting options you either have the High-Las beam cannon with the 2 sustained hits attacks at strength 12 and damage d6, or the pair of missile launchers with the L71 plus the Sagitaur missile. Generally speaking, the beam cannon works out as a bit more efficient against big tanks and vehicles, and the Sagitaur missile launcher is still quite threatening against those targets, but a little bit better against more medium infantry and lighter infantry due to having more shots. Scouting into the midfield is really quite nice though, means they can have just an even further boost to trying to get squads onto objectives right from round 1, and potentially get some line of sight on targets that your opponent might have been able to hide otherwise without that movement. Seem very popular for successful lists right now in any case. Literally every one of these top lists has been running them in multiples. Finally, for the fourth list, this is the other Leagues of Votann tournament winning list from 10th edition so far. This one by someone who recorded their name as XL, using it to take first at the Banished Cup with 4 wins and 1 draw. Interestingly enough, this one's Achilles heel also seemed to be Chaos Knights for some reason, a draw in round 5. This list is a fairly funky looking one, and it goes spectacularly heavy on the characters and the Thunderkyn. The core damage dealers of the list look like they're just 3 units of the Brokhyr with the Graviton Blast Cannons, each one of them having a Brokhyr Iron Master in the unit, one with Grim Demeanor. You really don't want to be getting within 18 inches of any of those, or they're going to make a mess. There's a unit of the Einhyr Hearthguard who take the Teleport crest. They could either be running with the Carl or the Einhyr Champion. The Carl takes the Mass Gauntlet and a long list, so I'd guess that he's more likely to be in there, as if he's got the long list it's going to be more likely that he actually gets to use that if he's heading up the big unit, and perhaps that means that the Einhyr Champion is just running solo with Axe and Teleport crest, even though I don't think that he's allowed to teleport unless you're actually in a unit. In any case, the big Einhyr block takes the Vulcanite Disintegrators and the Concussion Hammer on the Thane. And then there's 3 Sagitaurs, these ones without war gear recorded. I guess probably that means the Hylas beams as they're technically the default war gear. One of them has a unit of Chthonian Berserks inside of it. Then it looks like the other 2 are probably transporting 2 individual Grimnir that aren't with Hearthkin warriors at all. As mentioned, they are fairly cheap at 65 points, and at least fairly dangerous with that big hitting psychic shooting attack. An interesting choice though, having them in the Sagitaurs as opposed to Hearthkin. Finally, the list is pretty heavy on the bikes as well. One big unit of 6 Hernkin Pioneers with the Rotary Cannon and all the upgrades, and then 2 more units of 3 of them with the Rotary Cannon and Searchlight and Scanner. The Leagues of Votann do like to bring their scouting goodness. They could definitely put a bunch of pinpoint firepower on one key unit with the +1 to wound early on. Overall, looks really good fun. I guess the main challenge will be trying to deliver those Thunderkyn into damage dealing range with the blast cannons. Though I guess while they're stomping up the board, there'll be a whole load of other things rushing them with Scout, so the opponent might have some other things to worry about. In any case though, really quite positive to see quite so many people doing well with the kin in 10th edition after the update. As always, let me know any thoughts on the list, or if there's anything that I've misunderstood or got wrong, feel free to clarify things down in the comments. I feel like Leagues of Votann in their current states might just be a little bit less obvious how things are being used in terms of transports or characters, and a couple of these lists could definitely be played in very different ways, maybe even flexing between opponents I suppose. In any case, if you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new things just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.